All right, so we're going to talk about SOPs, reports, and regulations. Each is a big topic that, wish I could have more time to focus on, but they're big topics. So I'm going to try to do the best I can. Sounds boring, I know. But I'm going to try to do the best I can to keep you awake. It's an important topic, so try to bear with me. I like to tell people that I'm actually told I have to do this anytime I'm talking about regulations, that I do sit on the board for Virginia for the Asbestos Lead and Home Inspectors Board, but I'm not giving legal advice, and my opinion is just my opinion. It's not the collective opinion of the board. As licensed inspectors, we all have SOPs, state regulations that tell us what's expected of us. Tells you, what has to be inspected, what must be in reports, and usually the regulations also goes into what's acceptable as behavior. So know the rules. Contract is a good start to have when you're doing inspections. This is a great heading for a contract. But does that legally binding contract comply with the regulation, with your state regulations? In Virginia, I find that most contracts that I see are missing key elements that make them not compliant with Virginia regulations. And briefly, I'll just say that you get a complaint, they're not going to look just at the complaint. They're going to look at your report and your contract. Yeah, you can shut them. Yeah, thank you. Here's a snip out of a contract. The party agrees that Virginia law, and then it says ASHI standards or practice. Read that. The parties agree that that Virginia law, then it says the ASHI standards in quotes, shall define the standards of the inspection, basically. Virginia law and ASHI standards are not the same. So got to remember that. Our reports required. The ASHI SOP requires a report. Maryland regulations require a report. Virginia requires a report. So yes, they are required. And your E&O insurance carriers probably require a report. And North Carolina also requires a report. I think we can agree that reports are required, and it's an industry standard to have reports, right? Let's talk about what's generally included in reports. Generally, the client's name is on the report. The client's name is required in Virginia. And I'm not sure about other states because, like, for example, Maryland is difficult to figure it out, but I think it probably is. And it's also required in the report on the contract in Virginia. The physical address of the property is usually on the report, and it's required in Virginia. Inspector's name is required on the report. It's usually on the report, and it's also required in Virginia. Your license number is usually on a report, and it's also required in Virginia. In Virginia, the expiration of your license is required on the report, but it's not required on contracts. Generally, the inspection company identification is on the report. Generally speaking, it's only required in Virginia if it's applicable. The inspector's address is usually on the report, and it's required in Virginia and on the contract. The phone number of the inspector is usually on the report, and it's required in Virginia. General report comments, that's common, it's not always required, and it depends on where you're at. But in general, the date of the inspection and start and stop times is required in Virginia. It may not be required in other states. Weather conditions is sometimes on reports. It's required in Virginia. I commonly do not find start and stop times and weather on reports when I look at reports that I'm reviewing for D4. Very common issue. Other report
John, why do you review reports for D4?
When you get a complaint, most of the time what happens is an investigator will eventually contact a board member, and it's usually, if it's a home inspector involved, they'll contact a home inspector board member. So there's 3 inspectors on the board, and they will ask you to look at things, and usually they already have a list of things that they see that they think is wrong, but they want you to basically to confirm or disagree with what they found. And I do sometimes disagree with what they found, but most of the time I find things that they haven't found, because their investigators are investigating everybody that's licensed under D4. They're realtors, hairdressers, everybody. The other common report information would be the address, the client's address. I shouldn't say that's common. Actually, I'm just want to make a point about this. This is not common. Client's phone number, again, it's not common. It is currently required in Virginia to have both of those on the report, but there's a board amendment that I'll take credit for, because I actually was the one that implemented this amendment, that they delete that part. But to add contact information. So, which means it could be just an email address. It's still under regulatory review. So, executive review, I should say. The other common report information would be a realtor. Again, it's not always on reports. It's just sometimes commonly on reports. May not even be the right word, but I do see it on reports usually. In Virginia, that's not required, but it could be substituted as or in lieu of the client's information. It could be the realtor, because the realtor is acting on behalf of the client. Identification of others is sometimes on report. I've heard people say they don't do this. I don't understand. I'm not saying what you should do. I'm just telling you what some people do. They put, who's at the report, at the inspection. Ideally,
I actually do not see what none of that has anything to do with the house, and especially the realtor's name, and especially the client's name. I think whatever you have here is overboard. This is going.
Some of this is required in Virginia. So, but this is not.
I wouldn't even mention it then. It should not be something that's even mentioned. I mean, this is going overboard. Okay, this is not the house. We're there to report on the house, not on witnesses. Okay.
I'm just telling you what I see on reports.
Well, I encourage you to vote.
Yeah. Examples would be family members, contractors, homeowners, inspectors in training. Sometimes if I have somebody ride along with me, as to get experience, I'll note them as being there. Picture of the house, not required. It's a good idea. It's good marketing. Does the orientation of the photo matter? So this is a photo of the house, but it's basically, standing on its side. It speaks to professionalism and credibility. It immediately comes to question when you see that. Other report content, some reports have a comment about who owns the report. I've heard people say the client owns the report. I've heard people say that the inspector owns the report, or both. but some people put that on their report. I have a statement on my report that the inspection is in the report is confidential, and it's only, you know, it's only for the client and not transferable. Quickly, I was going to say, do you seek permission before giving the report to realtors? Have you ever been instructed not to give the report to a realtor? I have several times. Just so you know, in Virginia, it's sharing a report without a client's approval is a conflict of interest violation. If there's a complaint and it can be shown that you didn't get permission, you could be sanctioned. Descriptive information is sometimes on reports, not required. Square footage, year built. Some people say you should use a source of where you got that, you know, MLS. You can say approximate or use circa. Some people put occupied or not, furnished or not, utilities on or off, style, foundation type, define orientation, which is, I think is important because you want people to understand your viewpoint.
I don't understand. We're not appraisers. I'm not there to check the square footage.
And I didn't say square footage. I said some people list it as the square feet. A statement to read the full report is a lot of times on the report. Sometimes it's in the summary. A summary is a good idea. It's not required. Point out that many clients only read the summary, but it's definitely not required in Virginia, and but it is required in some states. I think, I believe North Carolina requires a summary.
I'm going to ask people to please raise your hand rather than interrupting the speaker. Please raise your hand and I will call on you. Thank you.
So here's just a suggested, what you could, how to introduce the summary report. Not required, just giving you something to think about. Best practices. Your report should communicate clear language, the story of the house. A well-designed, easy read report is a great marketing opportunity. A point to keep in mind is a good report won't save a bad inspection, and a bad report can wreck a good inspection. It's very true, very true. And I want to emphasize that marketing thing. I tell people sometimes getting into business that your report is probably your best marketing, because when people like it, they'll tell somebody else, and then somebody else will tell somebody else. And, you know, same thing goes with realtors. If they like your report, the way it's laid out, easy to understand, they're more likely to call you again or have someone call you. The inspection reports, they vary greatly. Some are checklist style, others are more narrative style. Point this out, complying with Virginia regulations, using a checklist style is going to be difficult because Virginia regulations are nothing like most states. The essentials of a professional report is to identify, tell the client what you inspected and discovered, describe components required by the standard, explain, tell the client why you should care, and advise what action they should take. These are good best practice essentials. Photos. Photos are not part of the SOP or any state regulation that I know of. But reports with photos are expected, and they're now probably considered an industry standard. I haven't seen a report without photos in a long time. A photo is worth 1,000 words. That's a saying that you hear. Be sure to control expectations of your photos. Example would be the photos in this report do not depict every photo. Don't depict every, they help to clarify what's documented. They do not add to the importance of the conditions photographs, nor diminish the the area is not photographed. A quick story is, I've been doing this a long time. Years ago, when computer reports and photos first started going into as a kind of a common thing with reports, I had a realtor that was an old guy. He's actually now dead. He told me he hates photos, that he said he felt like it emphasized defects and he did not like them at all, and actually asked me not to do them. And but he was an old school guy and he just did not like photos. Be careful be careful that you're not photographing something that you're not documenting or as an unattended type of thing. You know, in other words, you're taking a photo of something, trying to demonstrate something, but there's something else in that photo that you're not documenting. That can cause you problems. An example of that would be, I used to chair the ASHI technical committee for 3 years. And years back, this has been a long time ago, they used to, the technical committee would review the photos submitted to be put in the ASHI reporter. And commonly, the technical committee would have a photo and say, well, this is, they have a caption under the photo that's saying that something's wrong. A lot of times what they're saying is wrong is not wrong, but there was something else in the photo that was wrong. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. It's just make sure you're documenting properly. Use photos to control your liability. Like, you know, if there's some reason you can't open an electrical panel, or some reason you can't go in a crawl space, or maybe you want to document that you did open the electrical panel. But you should document that sort of thing with photographs, or try, it's better. It's a good practice. Wet crawl spaces you can't get into, take a picture of the wet crawl space, that sort of thing. Or even finished basements that you can't see the foundation. It's good to make a comment and document that you can't see the foundation. Add photos that are of the roof, if they're good or bad, but make sure your photo matches your description. Make sure you're not photographing this to say this is a good roof when it's really not. You don't want to say the roof is watertight, may need repairs in the near future. Would not match that photo. So be careful with that sort of thing. You don't want to say roof shingles show wear, recommend budgeting for replacement, when you really should be saying that they're worn out and recommend immediate replacement. Visible repairs visible on roof, recommend monitoring. That would not be a good thing to do. Not a best practice. There are indications of an attic or past fire, but it appears they've been repaired. That would not be a good way to go about that. You really should be going further into, maybe even with that case, you probably should be recommending an engineer. It's not a best practice. Often inspectors, especially multi-inspector companies, they have a list of minimum required inspections. I know that to be true. I know a guy who owns a company that has like 8 inspectors, and he has minimum inspections, minimum photos. Be careful not to allow the photo gathering to interfere with your focus and your SOP requirements. You know what I mean by that? Don't be trying to, I got to get a photo of this, don't get a photo, then you miss something big. It's best practice to reference the SOP that you're following. In some states, it's required. Scope of inspection. Inspection will be in pursuant to minimum standards established by the Virginia Home Inspection Regulations, or inspection was performed in accordance with the ASHI standards unless otherwise noted in the agreement. That's an examples. Are they equivalent? ASHI SOPs, InterNACHI SOPs, state regulations. Are they equivalent? My inspection and report complies with the ASHI SOP, or it could say the International ASHI SOP, which also means I'm complying with state regulations. Is that a good, is that a good statement? It's not. It's, let's explore this, but don't shoot the messenger. Licensing regulations are not suggestions. They're not optional. And I think a lot of guys think they are, but they're not. Here's a snip out of a contract in Virginia that the inspection is in accordance with the standards of practice of the International Association of Certified Home Inspectors. Unless you're licensed in a state that allows you to pick your SOP, the only one I could actually find, now I didn't look at all of them, but the only one I could find was Kentucky. You're not going to be in compliance with state regulations. Most state licensing regulations are not optional. In Maryland, it clearly says that you have to, that the purpose is to have the minimum and uniform standards performance by the Maryland State Commission of Real Estate Appraisers and Home Inspectors. So that means minimum is this Maryland SOP. In Virginia, the Virginia regulations have lots of must. It's just full of things you have to do. They're not, must means they're essential. You have to do it. You must inspect, you must describe, that sort of thing. They're not optional. Scope and limitations. Scope can be explained as a boundary. The inspector is responsible for which is inside the boundary. It's in scope. An inspector is not responsible for that which is not inside the boundary. It's out of scope. SOPs have scopes and limitations. What is a standards of practice? It's a guideline or criteria to determine the acceptability or quality of service. The minimum required is to perform a good service. It defines the objective, the scope, the limitations of the service. Establishes an agreement between the inspector and the client regarding the service. It helps establish reasonable client expectations, helps protect the inspector against unreasonable client expectations. Sometimes unreasonable expectations in home inspections sometimes clients have unreasonable expectations. Sometimes the unreasonable expectations prevail. And we know that, right? Debunking a common misunderstanding. A common persistent misunderstanding is that an inspection performed to the full compliance with the SOP is somewhat or somehow not adequate. An SOP compliant inspection is a good inspection, and it is all that that a reasonable client should expect. The problem is that many inspections are not COP compliant. Some inspectors perform beyond the SOP in some areas and fall short in other areas. That's very, very common. And a lot of times I think it goes back to your strong suits. In other words, if you have a background in electrical, it's natural that you're going to probably go beyond the standards in the electrical, but may not be so much in the other areas. Professional associations such as ASHI, ASHI, et cetera, there's, I think, 3 or 4. They all have SOPs. There's 37 states that have licensing regulations. Most licensed states have a state SOP. Some adopt the ASHI SOP, Tennessee and South Carolina, and I think Maryland is pretty close to the ASHI SOP. A few let you pick your own, like Kentucky, but Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, you have to follow the regulations that are set up in the law, basically. They are all similar, but there's important differences that exist, especially in Virginia, and those differences can have major impact on the inspection and the report. So that's the map of where Inspectors are licensed to some degree. The one the reason North Carolina is not colored is because North Carolina is the only state that don't use the National Home Inspectors exam. They have their own exam. Most states have licensing that have license have their own SOP. They're not suggestions. The Virginia regulations are must do. They are not optional. Maryland and North Carolina are also not optional. It's best practice to is it best practice to subscribe to more than one SOP? It's not a good idea. It's important that the inspector reference only one SOP in the inspection agreement and the report to avoid conflict and confusion. Conflict and confusion may open you up to more liability. May be a good question for your attorney. If you practice in more than one state, use the SOP that applies to where the house is located. This might mean that you have to use different templates depending on where you're at. Is it clear to name ASHI SOP and Virginia regulations, or is it confusing? So if you look at that statement or that header, it's in a report. It says using the national recognized standards of practice for the ASHI and the regulations set forth in the Code of Virginia. I find it to be more confusing. Probably a good question for your attorney on whether it opens you up to more legal scrutiny. Going beyond the standards, you got to understand the risk. Standards, whether it's the ASHI SOP or a standard established in your state licensing regulations, are the minimum standards. If you contradict your SOP by identifying and inspecting the excluded items, you may potentially weaken its ability to protect you. But you can go far beyond the standards as you feel comfortable doing. But if you do, you have to accept there may be some additional liability, but really it boils down to it's a business decision. This is especially true if you're not consistent. In other words, if you inspect and report on out-of-scope issues on some houses, but others you don't, and later on somebody can show that you, I'm using doors and locks as an example, but you could also use mold. If you report on doors and locks or mold, or it could be a variety of things, and you don't do it in one house for some reason, and you may have a good reason, and somebody can show that you did it in others, it could be a problem for you. Somebody can show that that you've been doing it, and it could be a problem. So here's an interesting one that I'll talk to you about. Is what if you inspect the same house twice for two different clients, and you report a defect on the first one that you didn't report on the second one? And I'm gonna just use an example, but this was a court case that I was involved in. Let's just say you did an inspection for a client and they had a wet crawl space. And months later, they didn't buy the house. Months later, you do the same house for a different client, and you didn't report it because it wasn't wet. And they buy the house. Several years go by, and they discover they have serious foundation problems. And they actually got the report from the first client because the realtor supplied it to them. And they make a legal case out of it. I kind of wrestle with, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, but because you have to look at things as you see them. But I kind of wonder, this particular case, it makes you wonder, what you should do. But I think in hindsight, me personally, if I knew something was wrong the first time, I'm going to look at it really closely, and I'm going to try to figure out why it's not the same way. It could be because the weather has changed. So anybody want to comment on that? Because this was actually a $300,000 lawsuit that I was involved in. And it was a jury trial. I was supposed to testify next week. They settled it. But anybody want to comment on that? Because I'm gonna just tell you the quick story of what I think happened, because I was hired as an expert, and I was actually on behalf of the home inspector before you start throwing anything at me. But I was actually on the side of the home inspector. I think what happened was they had a moisture problem. The homeowners, because it was 2 years later, they hired a contractor that was not qualified. And the contractor went into the crawl space and dug out along the footing to expose the footing and compromised the foundation. And the foundation had serious cracks. And the reason I come up with that is because I could see photos in the first two reports, and I could see photos when I went there, or I could see when I saw there. And I was also supplied with what the homeowner had gotten estimates. And I noticed that the estimates were, from people who do not foundation work, but they were given estimates to fix drainage system type stuff. And I think that's what happened, because the system that they put in was new and they compromised the foundation. And I think that's probably why they got settled, because that was my opinion about it, and they settled it. Anybody want to comment on that, or what you would do if you had a defect in the house and you inspected the same house several months later?
I have a question or a comment there. In scientific realms, there's something called a non-destructive test, an NDT. And it's intended to like turn a doorknob. But if the doorknob breaks when I turn the doorknob, and turning the doorknob is considered reasonable, then I shouldn't be held accountable, because it's a non-destructive test procedure.
Yep.
And I don't hear that language in this case with home inspections. And I think we should hear that language, because there's lots of tests that are non-destructive, but they may reveal a defect.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could comment on that, similar to what you were just saying.
Well, I'm going to talk about tests in a minute, but I agree with you. If you test a GFCI and the GFCI fails, the GFCI failed because you're doing your job. And but I've actually had homeowners try to say that I had to fix it because I broke it, but I said, I'm not fixing it. So I'll talk a little bit about something that you probably don't hear much about, but it's in the legal world, it's real. Standard practice versus standard of care. What's the difference? Standards of practice is a guideline or a criteria determining the acceptability or the quality of service. A standard of care is a level of care normally practiced by reasonable, prudent inspectors under similar circumstances during the same time frame. So if everybody in this room does something a certain way, like let's just say, if everybody in this room, we'll talk about this later, but if everybody in this room is testing receptacles or testing GFCIs, that's a standard of care. Everybody's doing it. But it's not the same thing as a standard of practice, but we will talk a little bit about that. So what's the difference? The standard of care is not defined by the SOP. Standard of duty is like a standard of duty. A standard of care is like a standard of duty. It's determined by the standard that would be exercised by reasonable, prudent other professionals in that line of work. So everybody, or the inspectors that are in your area, if they're doing certain things, that you're probably going to be held to that standard of care. Some examples would be the SOP for all the standards, SOPs, for even the regulations are visual inspections. So any tool or toy used more than a flashlight or a screwdriver to remove a panel cover, because usually, not all of them, but some SOPs require you to remove panel covers. You basically are exceeding the SOP. But it often would be an industry, it would be an industry that's a standard of care because everybody's doing it. Photos, 25 years ago, when I first started doing inspections, photos and reports were rare. I mean, I think I remember somebody was doing like Polaroid photos, but they were rare because computer reports or computer generated reports was just not. I mean, I actually, me and I think US Inspect was actually the first one in Richmond that actually did computer reports. But now they are, photos are pretty much an industry standard, or not an industry standard, but they're standard of care for sure. 25 years ago, the use of a moisture meter was not common. Now moisture meters are standard tools that most every inspector carries. So it's a standard of care probably in most circumstances. I used to work when I first started doing inspections, I was working for another company. And the guy I worked for, he actually refused he didn't want me to even have a moisture meter. He said he thought it increased his liability. And he told me if I used it, not to let anybody see me using it. So that's just how it's changed in 25 years. The use of ladders is a standard of care, but if every inspector in your area is using a 24 foot extension ladder and you don't, it's probably outside of the standard of care. Because if every inspector in your area is using a 24 foot ladder, and I'm just using that number, it don't have to be, it could be 16 foot ladder, or it could be no ladder. If nobody's using them, it's probably not a standard of care. The company I used to work for, they had a rule that you couldn't have more than a 16 foot ladder because of liability. They didn't want the liability of it. And now people carry no ladders. They carry 24 foot ladders. They call 32 foot ladders. So it's kind of all over the place. I don't even know if I could even say that there is a standard of carry in my area. I mean, because I think they're all over the place. We as an industry, we keep adding to our standard of care. So, I suspect that, I think a lot of people now have infrared cameras, but I think probably maybe not even 10 years, but maybe another 5 years. I think every inspector will have an infrared camera, and probably every inspector will have a drone because they're really common now. So if everybody has a drone and you don't have one, you could be outside of the standard of care. But any tool or toy could be beyond, or could be exceeding the standards of practice. Like testing. Testing is overall all inspection SOPs, all state regulations, they basically all say in some way or another, they say they're visual inspections. But testing receptacles is a level of care that's normally practiced by reasonable and prudent home inspectors. So I suspect that it's a standard of care. It's not a standard of practice. In North Carolina, it's a little different. In North Carolina, they have to check the polarity and grounding of receptacles within 6 feet of sinks. That's required in North Carolina. So that would be a standard of practice in North Carolina. Again, the Maryland definition of inspect says, basically says that examine readily accessible systems and components. But it does say in their standards of practice set forth in this chapter, says apply to a visual inspection of the readily accessible areas, acts to identify visible defects. So that all implies they're talking about a visual inspection. It does, the Maryland SOP does say that standards are not intended to be technically exhaustive. The ASHI SOP says the same thing. And Maryland defines what the technical exhaustive means, which if you look right there in that last or next to the last sentence, it says testing. The ASHI definition also talks about visually observable. So we're talking about visual inspections. Again, the ASHI standards are also clearly says they're not technically exhaustive. And they define what that means. Again, it goes back to testing. In North Carolina, the definition says visual examination. Virginia regulation does require, the Virginia regulations require you to have a contract that says that their inspection report is based upon a visual observation of the existing conditions. So again, Virginia visual inspection does not, and Virginia regulation does not mention or define technically exhaustive. It does say that you have to inspect and describe readily accessible and readily observable defects. Readily observable, not defined by, but means easy to see. And this is in the Virginia regulations. It's not defined, but it means easy to see, which is visible. So can we agree that SOPs, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, et cetera, are either defined or implied as visual inspections? Everybody kind of agree with that? They're visual inspections. We can agree that they're not technically exhaustive. They don't supposed to be. We can
Wait a minute. I mean, I understand that the language of the SOP says that a home inspection is not technically exhaustive. But it also says that you can exceed the standard.
Yep.
And that sounds contradictory to me. I mean, some people do inspections that I would think of as technically exhaustive.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they call it a home inspection, and I think legitimately so. So
Yeah, I don't think it's anything that says you can't exceed these standards. You just can't, you have to do the minimum. But, you know, I'm trying to make a point that testing is really not the standard. It's really more of a standard of care. It's what everybody does. So it's what's expected. Maybe that doesn't make sense, and that's just the way I look at it. But so I think we can probably at least agree that the level of care that's normally practiced is to test receptacles. Again, we talked about this briefly a minute ago, but North Carolina, it's definitely in their standards. They have to test polarity and grounding within 6 feet of sinks. That's required in the North Carolina regulations. It does not show in Virginia or Maryland or ASHI or InterNACHI. It doesn't. That wording doesn't show in the standards. So again, scope is inside boundary, in scopes. The limitations are outside of boundary, out scope. Best practice would be to have limitations documenting that in your report. Limitations are a must in Virginia. It's required in the regulations. You have to list your limitations. Basically, it says that to the extent that the component or system cannot be inspected, the home inspection report must identify such components and systems and provide explanation why the component or system was not inspected. It's required.
So Larry, you got your hand up?
Yes, if you go back to the standard of care, the 3 slides back. The last bullet point, can we agree that testing, let's see. Was there another conclusion that you came to after that one?
I don't think so.
Okay, okay, all right. Because I was going to agree with where Hollis was headed a minute ago. Because I think you said, go back to that one more time. Yeah. Can we agree that any tool or toy used more than a flashlight and a screwdriver is exceeding the SOP in most cases? I think you should point out in that sentence that even though it may be exceeding the standard of practice, it would definitely be within many, many standards of care.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, okay, all right. I just wanted to make sure that
Yeah.
that was clear and that the standard of practice, once again, is the bare minimum.
Bare minimum, yep.
Yes, okay, all right, understood.
You have to, if something is turned off, winterized, you should really put that in your report. Photo documentations of limitations are a best practice. So if you get to somewhere and it has that and you can't inspect the bathtub, you probably should be noting that in your report, and take a photo would be great. You probably should also warn that, or put in your report, that there could be concealed defects. You probably should recommend further evaluation. Again, same thing goes here. Documentation and pictures is worth 1,000 words. Garage full of stuff. If you can't get into the garage, you should be documenting that as a limitation. Closets are full of junk and you can't get into the attic. You see the attic up here. Quick story is that years ago, I found out, I actually know the inspector now, but I didn't know him at the time, but I found out that there was an inspector getting sued, and I actually went to sit in the audience, and he did not get into the attic because of this. This is not the photo, but he had a full attic, full closet. He couldn't get into the attic, and they were suing him for a bad roof. And there were stains all over the roof sheathing, but he did not get into the attic, so he didn't see that. And I remember, like I was standing here now, the judge says, you should have made an effort to get in the attic. Now, do I agree with that? No, I don't agree with that. But I think that the important part is you really need to be documenting limitations and make it clear that you can't get in there and that there could be defects. Warned that there could be defects, recommend further evaluation. So this slide, also I put it here to remind me that, again, years ago, this inspector actually is not in business anymore, but I was drawn into a case where a realtor and inspector were good friends. They was alleged that they were in cahoots with each other, but there was a house that there were groundhogs in the crawl space, and he did not go in the crawl space, and he noted in his report that he didn't go in the crawl space, but that's all he said. The problem was you could take the crawl space door off and see that there was a bunch of mess. The insulation was falling, the wood was rotted, the water was everywhere. It was alleged that him and the realtor were in cahoots, and the judge actually made him split the cost of fixing it. So that inspector is no longer around. He went out of business a long time ago. But you gotta report things that you can't do, can't get into. There was also a depot case that that one inspector reported that he could not get into the crawl space, and another inspector came in later. I think it was like the person got transferred, so they had to sell the house like 6 months later or something. And another inspector, first inspector was a big guy, like my size. The second guy was much smaller, and he reported issues, and they filed a complaint with Depot. And the problem was that he just didn't document it properly. It was too vague. He should have said it could be problems, that sort of thing. So he did get sanctioned because just lack of wording, really. Again, if you have a crawl space that you can't get into because there's a pipe or something blocking your access, you really should be noting that you can't get in, and really ideally it should be what area you can't get into. And this one says no access to the far left rear. So it really ought to be something more than limited access. I mean, sometimes limited access might work, but just depends on the situation. The ASHI SOP has a part of it says that you don't have to go you don't have to go in crawl spaces that are less than a certain size, 24 inches. This opening has to be a certain size, which I think is the same thing as the code says. If you're using that limitation, if you're working by that limitation, you really should have that as a limitation in your contract. And you probably should note it in your report. And again, warn that there could be issues that you can't see. So what about the green highlighted part of that statement there? Only representative number. Representative number is a word, it's wording that's used by the ASHI, INTERNACHI, SOPs, and in the Maryland and North Carolina licensing regulations. They all use it. Virginia does not use that word. So got to keep that in mind because it makes a difference. Yes, sir.
When you say sanctioned in Virginia from the depot, I'm thinking that could be one of three things, like a letter of reprimand or a fine, or they yank your license and you're out of business. Which is it in Virginia?
It's most of the time it's going to be a money fee.
Fine.
It can be that they because I've actually recommended or required somebody to have more training. It just depends on the situation. If I think it's because they don't know enough, and I could give you a long story about where an inspector misidentified chlorine and he caused the homeowner a bunch of money because he didn't know what he was looking at. And I recommend he have a class in interior inspections or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but I don't think there was a sanction involved. I think he just basically needed more education. To be suspended or revoked, which I've been involved in both, it pretty much has to be something really bad. If you, I can tell you how you get suspended really quick. If you don't communicate or don't cooperate with DPOR, you're gonna get suspended. Revoke is got to be really bad, and I don't want to go into details because I was involved in a case that inspector was license was revoked, but he deserved it. But usually it's fines. You know, it's like, you know, you go get sanctioned with a fine. Sometimes it's training. I don't think you ever get like just a letter. I don't know of anything like that. And sometimes it's, you know, if it's not justified, it's just nothing, you know, basically it just depends. So would that be compliant with Virginia regulations? See right here, it says representative number, counters and representative number of cabinets, doors, representative number, windows, representative number. Would that be compliant with Virginia regulations? No. What about that? Representative number can be a problem because it's not Virginia compliant. It can be okay in Maryland, North Carolina, or most everywhere else, but not Virginia. Representative number does not comply with the Virginia regulations. But I'm gonna give you an idea that I think would work. I would be okay with it as a board member. If you want to go with that, if you some kind of way document it in your contract, I'm not gonna have a problem with it because the regulations allows you to have limitations in your contract. So as long as it's clearly worded that you're going to only inspect a representative number of doors, windows, receptacles, whatever it might be, I'm probably going to be okay with it as a board member, but I'm just one guy. just so, you know, throw that out for you. Again, this what it says. It says that you can, except for what may be limited in a home inspection contract. So if you have something limited in your contract, I'm going to be okay with it, as long as it's not outrageous type thing. Just so you know, you probably all heard about the smoke alarm things coming up. The new law came in. You're not going to be able to opt out of that. It's what happened was some home inspectors that like to be boisterous wrote letters in and saying that they won't go and test smoke alarm. They were just going to contract out of it. And so they put it into the regulations that you can't do that. So Virginia regulations allows limitations. So this is just an example how you could do it, where multiple instances of the same component exist. The representative number shall be expected. I don't have a problem with that as a board member myself. As long as it's got to be in the contract, though. Point out that Virginia uses and defines readily accessible as be able to get to it without moving or removing obstacles. What does inconsistent mean? Because it says that you can have limitations as long as they're not inconsistent with the regulations. We'll give you an example. This was like, say, a depot case, and I was actually the person that was overseeing or listening to this case. The contract that the inspector used said that he basically tried to define his defect as more than $1,000. That's how he was trying to define in his contract what a deficiency was. And as a board member, I viewed this as being inconsistent with the regulations because it's not what other inspectors are doing. And it's not, and I didn't consider it to be safeguarding the public, because there's a regulation in the Virginia regulations that you have to basically safeguard the public. Definitely not a standard of care. A limitation in scope would be more like if you have multiple instances of the same component, you could basically put it in your contract that the only representative number should be inspected or shall be inspected. Here's another example. The complainant hired a home inspector, and after they moved in, they discovered that there was a roof leak that cost $400 to pat, numerous windows that were leaking, dead receptacle, and the items went on, adding up to be about $20,000. The inspector, again, this is a deep work case, the inspector basically refused to pay or communicate with them, or with Deepore, actually. The contract basically tried to define that the defect would be more than $500. But the problem is that they added up, there was a bunch of stuff wrong, and they added up to be $20,000. So I considered it to be not consistent with the regulations or the SOP, because a prudent inspector doesn't do that. Well, I've never even seen anybody trying to do this except for this guy, but maybe somebody does, but I just don't think, I think you got to be really careful about it. Plus his contract didn't even say, remember I said he had a roof and leak, and they had leaky windows. Well, his contract didn't even mention roof or windows. If you notice, it says inspection including foundation, structure, exterior, heating and air conditioning, plumbing, electrical, interior, kitchen, and appliances. Well, maybe you could say that the exterior is part of the roof, or the windows are part of the exterior. I don't know, but they didn't specifically spell it out as the regulations require. So here's some photos. The windows were leaking, but there was no commentary about it. There's no description of the leak. It just, they had photos and they had captions below the photos. but that's just not enough. It's just not enough. It's probably was just an omission, mistake, but the picture documentation is really not enough. Again, $500 as a board member, I viewed it as an attempt to define a defect that would not be consistent with regulations or with what other prudent inspectors would do. And I also found it to be failing to act as a licensee in a manner to safeguard the interests of the public, which is prohibited in Virginia. And there's also other contract issues. So this person got sanctioned heavily. Few examples of some differences between the ASHI SOP and the must comply with Virginia regulations. It's kitchen appliances, main water valves, kitchen exhaust systems, bathroom exhaust, clothes dryer exhaust, all required by ASHI and ASHI. And none of these are specifically required in Virginia regulations. Maryland requires a description of the main water shutoff valve, and it requires inspection of mechanical ventilation systems, which I guess could be falling into the kitchen, bathroom, and exhaust or dryer. Should you ignore this if you're not specifically required to inspect it in your regulations? Like Virginia doesn't really say dryer ducts. Should you ignore that if you see that?
No.
It's, what if a complaint is filed that you fail to report a fire hazard? And the investigator is going to look into it, and if they can be shown that you failed to safeguard the public, you're going to be sanctioned. Virginia regulations doesn't really mention insulation in crawl spaces. It does say that in the SOP for ASHI, I blank Maryland, but it doesn't say that in Virginia. Virginia says you have to inspect the crawl space, but it doesn't mention insulation. It does say crawl space ventilation and vapor barriers. But maybe it could be the crawl space should include insulation. I mean, I guess you can make a case for that, but it doesn't specifically say insulation in crawl space. Probably a mistake to ignore industry standards just because there's no specific regulations, because it could be a standard of care, and it could be that you're not protecting the public that you're being hired to protect. Is there a requirement to report on a potential impact of a defect? The ASHI SOP requires reasoning or explanation as to the nature of the deficiencies reported that are now not self-evident. I know Virginia don't, but I didn't see anything in Maryland that required that. Do you know, Hollis, or anybody knows it's Maryland? I couldn't find anything that said that. Probably a best practice. I know a lot of guys, a lot of inspectors do this regularly. They report, what the implications are. It's probably a good practice. For an example, bad roof has a potential for leaking, or the system is unsafe would be an example. Just a quick story is, years ago, I reported that there was a roof collar, plumbing collar, that was split, and I didn't say much more than that. And I think I probably said recommend repair. The guy bought the house, moved in. It was soon after he moved in, there was a tropical storm that came through, and it leaked so much that it actually made his ceiling of his laundry room cave in. And he called me just raising Cain because I didn't tell him it was going to be a leak. And I said, well, I told you the plumbing collar was split, but you can't assume that people know what you're talking about. And you learn lessons as you go along. And that was one of the lessons I learned, is that if I see something that's going to leak or probably going to leak, I'm going to say potential for leak is high. And I do that commonly. Was you raising your hand? Okay. North Carolina regulations explains that you have to report implications of defective conditions. So they do have it in their regulations. We're in the communication business. The report is the legal record. It doesn't matter what you verbally say. It only matters what you have in that report. So it's critically important. You only get one chance to get it right. Once you push that send button and it goes out, it's gone, and you can't have a redo. It's key to avoid technical jargon without translation. And what I mean by that is, I think I have another slide about it, but you can't talk about stuff that most people have no idea what you're talking about. I had a guy ask me one day what a shingle was, because I said something about the shingle. He said, "What is a shingle?" So you just don't know. A lot of people have no clue about anything. So you have to always think about that. The important stuff first in a summary is reader friendly. Years ago, I actually did a survey with clients and realtors about where they would prefer the summary, and it was almost unanimously they want the summary in the beginning. And it's because realtors are lazy. They don't want to have to look for it. They want it up front. Makes sense, but it's probably reader friendly. Not saying that's the only way to do it. I don't want to say that. Past tense or present tense in describing. I know that there's a lot of people who disagree with this, and anything I'm telling you, it doesn't mean that I'm right, or I'm wrong, or I'm just telling you what I think. And a lot of people say that past tense is better. A lot of people say present tense is better. There is rot. There was rot. There is a leak. There was a leak. There is no heat. There was no heat. I've heard and read arguments in support of both ways by smart people. I've heard that past tense helps to create a more consistent report and implies that conditions may change. I've heard that writing in the past tense makes you less liable. If you report in the past tense, there may be some confusion on the client's part on whether the problem still exists. And I'll just give you an example. I have a daughter-in-law that has a master's degree in communication. And one day I was sitting with her and I was actually thinking about this. And I said, let me ask you a question. If you was reading a report and I said there was a roof leak, or would you rather me say there is a roof leak? And she said, well, when you say was, I immediately start thinking, is there still a roof leak? So, and I mean, she's got a master's degree and she actually works for an attorney. So, she's, I personally think present tense is better. To me, it just makes more sense. So you don't want the reader or the client, and I say reader because you don't never know who's going to be reading your report. It may be just your client if you're lucky, but it may be a judge, might be DPOR, maybe an attorney that's trying to figure out if they have a suit against you. You just want it to be, you don't want them to wonder about anything. Was it leaking while you were there, or is it just evidence of a leak? I personally like present tense better because but I've heard smart people argue both ways. Was somebody saying something? All right. Mistakes, avoid mistakes that damage your credibility. Report writing mistakes are inevitable. They're going to happen. We all make them, especially on first drafts. Poor grammar, misspelled words, contradictions within your report all damages your credibility. I've had times when I felt rushed to get out a report, long day, and after I typed that last sentence, instead of proofreading, I just pushed send report. And we've all done it, but proofreading is really where you catch your mistakes before you lose control of that report. Make sure your report is readable. Reader comprehension is critically important. A report should be clearly written so that any reader can understand it. How many times is anybody here? I've had realtors send me reports just numerous times and say, can you help me understand what this report is saying? If a realtor is sending you a report to another home inspector asking for help to understand it, you're making a mistake. I don't know how to bluntly tell you that, but I mean, a lot of times you may not know it, but if they're trying to get somebody like me to help them understand what you're saying, it's a problem. So just make sure, maybe you get somebody else to proofread your stuff to make sure it's understandable. It changes how your readers perceive you. If it's full of technical errors, readers might not even take you seriously. Spelling and grammar make mistakes or technical errors can reflect poorly on you and the quality of your work. I had a PhD client not long ago. Really nice guy, really smart guy. He teaches at one of the universities, and he sent me an email saying that the sentence in my report appeared to be truncated. And I said, truncated? So I said, I had to Google that. So what does that mean? Anyway, basically it means cut short or shortened. And after reading it, I agreed it was truncated. It was cut short. And, if I'd have proofreaded it, I probably would have caught it. And, but we all make mistakes. So I fixed it. Fortunately, he allowed me to fix it and send it to him again. Anyway, errors like that, it damages your credibility. Proofreading is a best practice. Commas and punctuations can totally change the meaning. I was actually trying to come up with a good example that involved the house, but I couldn't come up with anything, so I just used this. Let's eat dad means you're serving food to your kids, but let's eat dad without the comma means you're applying cannibalism. So it's important to get things right. Here's a snip out of a report that the apostrophe can be a costly error. So here's a snip out of a report that it's rock wool, and it has 3 feet. Has anybody ever seen 3 feet of rock wool insulation? It could be a costly mistake if somebody wants to be really nasty about it, because they say, well, you told me I had 3 feet. I only have 3 inches. Another interesting thing, I've never seen vapor barrier or painted sealants to be described as a vapor barrier. Anybody here heard of that? I mean, I never heard of that. Anyway, you got to make sure you get things like that right. It's better when you're talking about inches and feet. It's better just to either abbreviate inch or spell it out. It's so easy to make that mistake. Whoops. So describe and readily accessible, what do they mean? Describe is defined almost universally the same or closely the same. In ASHI and North Carolina, basically says it means to this means to report in writing a system or component by its type and other inspected characteristics to distinguish it from other systems or components used for the same purpose. Maryland, describe means to report a system component by its type or other observed significant characteristics to distinguish it from other systems and components. ASHI and Virginia are identical. And you can thank me for that, because Virginia was trying to come up with this definition of describe. And I said, man, we just need to go with something that's already established. I said, let's go with the ASHI standard definition, and they agreed. So identifying and writing a system component by its type and other distinguishing characteristics. Are there things that are required to describe in an industry standard? Meaning, Are ASHI and INRACHI state SOPs all similar? Let's explore this, but again, don't shoot the messenger. Uh, uh, Defects, the methods used to inspect crawl spaces, underfloor crawl space in attics, the foundation, the floor structure, the wall structure. These are things that are all kind of uniformly or globally are required to be describing in most standards and most SOPs. Floor structure, exterior roofing, methods to inspect the roof, interior water supply, heating equipment, including the energy sources, location of main water and shutoff valves. That doesn't show up in the Virginia regulations. Amperage rating of services, location of main disconnects, presence or absence of smoke alarms. That's going to change in Virginia. The predominant branch circuit wiring method, heating systems, including energy sources, cooling systems, including energy sources. Commonly, cooling system energy source is not put on reports and it's required. It's could get you sanctioned, so make sure you get it on there. I know it's silly. I think it's so silly, but it's, just basically electric. So installation, vapor retarders in unfinished spaces. Absence of installation in unfinished spaces. Describe the fireplace systems and components. The definition of describe in Virginia, we already talked about that, but what I want to talk to you about is that the board, and I was not in favor of this, but I got outvoted. They actually added an example. And the example I thought was really over the top. But this is the example they used that, as trying to what it means by describe. If they're talking about a floor covering like a carpet or wood floor, or oak wood floor or nylon carpet is not necessarily required, but only if the inspector knows that. It's just sort of over the top. The good thing about it is that emphasizes the level of description that DPOR is looking for. But the good thing about it is there's a proposed amendment to add the definition of describe in the Virginia regulations. It's still in the executive review process, but the example is not going to transfer, which I was glad of. And I didn't mention it because I knew it wasn't going in, and I didn't want to mention it because I didn't want it to go in because I just think it's kind of over the top.
So John, I got a trick question. If the energy source for an air conditioner is electric, what's the energy source for a heat pump and the heat mode?
I would say electric.
It's not the outdoor air.
I would look for electric myself, but I don't like that requirement myself, but I think it actually came up from, because some places out in Arizona, they use those, swamp coolers and stuff. I think that's where it came from years ago. The must wording in Virginia regulations is a, guidance document, especially the, example. It mandates that there's some description of some type, basically on everything we have to inspect. It's not like ASHI, North Carolina, Maryland. Virginia's the wording in the regulations is not like that. It basically, you have to describe everything you're inspecting. And that's unfortunately the way it is. If you read that line right there, it says must inspect the condition of and must describe. So it's not worded like that in the ASHI or Maryland. It's completely different. In support of descriptions, it provides useful information to clients, shows you looked at the component. SOP and state regulation requires it to various degrees. Against descriptions would be no one really cares. They just want the big stuff. I'll just give you an example. My wife says, I'll sometimes get her to look at my report and she says, who cares? She says, I just want to know what's wrong. And so, I mean, it's a valid point. It's really, that's what people look for. But another bad thing about descriptions is if you make a mistake, it can be used against you. Because if we can get to it, I don't know if we'll get to it, but if I'm looking at a complaint and they're complaining about something, and I'm looking at the report and I see that things are misidentified, your credibility is just already in question. Because I'm thinking that, you don't know what you're doing. And I could tell you lots of examples about that, but it's just, you got to know what you're, you got to make sure you got the right description of stuff. What I look for when I'm looking to make sure their descriptions are proper, I'm looking for descriptions that encourage clear communications and less misunderstanding. I don't think the intentions, or I don't interpret the intentions of the regulations to make it unreasonable or complicated. I do interpret that the regulations require a description on all that has to be inspected, but there's some exceptions to that, and I'm gonna get to it in a second. I look for what the must is on the regulations, contract limitations. I look at the inspection industry standards, what the industry is doing. And I also look at what's reasonable. I attempt to use a common sense approach. The level of description that it varies depending on the situation or the specific component being inspected. Some things that we inspect are common to every system, and trying to describe the characteristics could be unreasonable and would add no value to the report. So, and I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. So, for example, the way the regulations are written in Virginia, you have to describe related vent systems, flues, and chimneys. That seems unreasonable to me, and it really doesn't add any value to the report unless there's a defect. If there's a defect, you probably should have more description. But I do think you should report. It should be clear that you've inspected that, but doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a description, in my opinion. Roofing is one of the top 5 claims made against home inspectors. Proper descriptions are important. As a board member reviewing a complaint, misidentified roofing materials, it's hard to overlook when I'm trying to figure out if there's sanctions, if there's sanctions that are needed. So if something is not being identified properly, it could be a problem. Describing roof materials is an industry-wide standard. All the SOPs that I know of require descriptions of roofing. APDM, TPO, slate, so on. It's you also must describe any defect. Setting the expectations in your contract and report is important. Correct descriptions are critical. I have never understood why inspectors try to guess on service remaining life. For me, I just can't understand it, but there's no requirement for it. It greatly increases your liability. Another bad idea to me, in my opinion, I don't expect everybody to agree with me. We're in home inspectors. Home inspectors never agree about anything. But to me, it's a bad idea to try to tell your client that they have a 25 or 30-year roof. It basically is just increasing their expectations. I've seen reports say that they have a 50-year roof or a limited lifetime roof. It may be true that the manufacturer has that, but it's just why you put in your report that when you're not required to do it. Life for me, I can't understand it. If you insist on documenting expected life, I would use something more like a range, like the expected lifespan of a roof when new is 18 to 25 years, but it can vary depending on the conditions, that sort of thing. Would be a safer, less liability issue. What's the problem with this? This is a snip out of a report. So pay attention right here. It says description, asphalt shingles, EPDM. And then it says exaggerate rolls observed on TPO roof surface. So he's basically saying EPDM up here, but TPO here, and that looks like TPO. But that's an issue. I mean, because if they're complaining about this and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, he don't even have the descriptions right. And so right away, I'm thinking he's gonna have to be sanctioned some kind of way. So it's probably a better practice or a best practice to use whatever the manufacturer calls them. I have a pet peeve about people saying, and I'm gonna apologize because I know a lot of guys do it. I don't like people saying composition shingles. To me, it's just too vague. Now, I'm not saying that if it was a D-pour thing and I was looking at it, I would probably let it go. But I like something more like asphalt 3-tab shingles or asphalt agriculture shingles, me personally. It's critical that you describe the method you're inspecting the roof. You know, whether you're doing binoculars, some sort of a roof crawlbot, drone, ladder, walking, whatever. You really need to have that. That's a universal required thing that you have to do. And if you can't inspect it, you need to explain that in the report and why it wasn't inspected. There was a deport case that, and I'm going to just tell you the quick short version. The inspector got a complaint. The complaint had to do with some flashing, and his comment or his defense was, well, I couldn't see the flashing because I was using a drone. Well, he didn't report on the report how he inspected it. So there was an issue right there that, he didn't report how he inspected it. So if you see vegetation growing from a roof, it's probably not best to walk on it. And I hope that's goes without saying in the experienced inspectors here in the room, but usually that means it's bad. Don't walk on it, or you might end up downstairs. But document that. Take a photo, document it, that it's not safe, but then the roof is shot. Basically, that's better words than that, but you know what I mean. Again, you gotta like this one I hear, 30-year life expectancy is standard. I mean, why would you say that? I mean, it's just I just don't understand why you would say that. It just puts you at a higher level of liability. Raising expectations is that a best practice? No.
It's standard warranty.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I guess you could justify, but it's 30 years is probably very unrealistic. I mean, it's usually not going to last that long. Best practice is to avoid making statements that you can't verify. See stains on the roof or stains on the ceiling or on the roof sheathing, and you say they're old stains. They're old stains, indication of past roof leak. It's probably not the best unless you really actually know that for sure. How do you know that they're old or past?
So Larry's got his hand up again.
ASHI standards, in what the inspector shall inspect under B1, it says, it lists things not functioning properly, significant deficiency, unsafe, or are near the end of their service lives. And you're saying that we shouldn't be discussing their service lives. Could you clarify that a little?
No, I'm not saying that. I said that because I report stuff like that all the time. I'm saying don't try to predict how long it's going to last.
Okay, so, but if you say, in other words, instead of saying this is not going to last long, you say this is close to the service, the end of its typical service life, and you may want to budget for a new one.
Yeah, but I would be really cautious about how you word budget for renewal, because a lot of people think that doesn't mean now, and sometimes it means now.
Yeah.
But I don't understand why inspectors say the roof. I'll give you an example. I did a court case against an inspector that he said budget to replace within 5 years. The lady, all she saw was 5 years. Her insurance company would not cover the house until she replaced it after she moved in. So she sued the inspector. She didn't win, but all she saw was, she thought she had 5 years. And that's what I'm trying to relay to you, is just, it raises the expectations of the roof, and people
And if-
only see what they want to see.
And if they ask you, when you say this is within near the end of its typical life expectancy, and they say, what is its typical life expectancy? Aren't they adding 2 and 2 up in their brain?
Well, they could be, but I don't like trying to predict the future, is what I'm trying to say. Is I don't mind saying that it's near its end of life expectancy, which I do that all the time, but I just don't like, I don't understand why inspectors try to predict how long it's gonna last. It's just,
Yeah.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, but it's
Yeah,
just.
yeah.
to me,
If,
it's
if you're
different.
saying it's near its end of its life expectancy, their next question is going to be, what's its life expectancy? And then you're going to give them a number, and that's going to automatically, whether you say it or not, going to give them an expectation.
Yeah, good point. I don't usually go that way. I usually say recommend replacing. I don't ever say in the near future. I
Well,
don't
if
ever
you
use.
say recommending replacing, they're going to think right away.
That's what I do. I don't, if it's
Okay,
near its life
okay.
expectancy, I always say recommend replacing.
Oh, so you're recommending that they replace that water heater right away, just because it's
Yes,
regardless?
yes,
Okay. Gotcha.
yes.
All right.
So again, this is what we just talked about. If you have something on it that says budget to replace within 5 years, your client's going to only see 5 years. I can guarantee that's usually what they're going to see. Should be watertight for a number of years. I actually saw this on a report. To me, it's just crazy. I don't know why you would say that. Because the minute it's not watertight and another 6 months or a year, they're going to call you and they'll say, well, you said it should be watertight for a number of years. You're going to have a problem on your hand. Why predict the future? Descriptions are important. When I, as a board member, and I'm trying to figure out, if there's a sanction involved or needed, it's hard to overlook improper descriptions. Remember the definition to describe. That pretty much is, it's pretty much all the SOPs and regulations pretty much say the same thing. But it's, as an example, CPVC, PEX, PVC, galvanized, ABS, copper, etc. Plastic pipe is not enough. I still see people or inspectors using plastic pipe. It's not enough. If I'm reviewing it for DPOR and that's all's on there, I can promise you, I'm gonna say that's not a proper description. So it needs to be something more than that. I had a guy ride with me a couple times, 3 or 4 times that, I told him 3 times, I think it was, that he kept saying it was black he kept saying it was black PVC instead of ABS. And I said, it's not PVC, it's ABS. And he kept saying it. I finally told him in the 3rd or 4th time he rode with me, I said, you really need to rethink what you're trying to do. I said, I really don't think you know enough. And he actually went back to truck driving. So he was, so again, waste spent piping material there says plastic. It's really just not enough. It's not a proper description. So in Virginia, it goes a little further and it says that you have to inspect and describe fixtures. So I think it's unreasonable to expect that, but I do see a problem if you can't clearly look at the report and determine that you inspected the fixture. So you have to make sure you're clearly wording that you're inspecting the things you should be inspecting. The reader shouldn't have to wonder. You know, I wonder if he inspected that. That's a problem.
Actually, I've been an inspector for 30 years. What does that mean?
What do you mean?
Fixtures.
Like plumbing fixtures, plumbing fixtures.
The water heater?
No, like, faucets, tub faucets. Are you in,
There's shut off valves in the house?
no. You have to, the way are you Virginia inspector or no?
Yeah.
Or in Virginia, they basically don't say like Maryland does. Maryland says certain things you have to describe. Virginia says you have to describe everything you're inspecting. It's the way it's worded. I don't agree with it.
No, what,
So in my report, I say that I inspected the bathtub fixtures, but I don't do that. I just put it in my report that I inspected them so that they know I inspected them.
sinks, showers,
Yep,
tubs?
yep. Because if somebody's, I think I have an example here. If somebody's wondering if you inspected the toilet because the toilet now doesn't flush, they should be able to look at your report and say, yeah, he inspected the toilet. It says he did.
We do it. So
I interpret the Virginia regulations that requires you to describe the fixtures that were inspected. I think it's a best practice. Don't leave the reader guessing. If there are defects, you have to expand on the description. Example, the tile shower pan is leaking, or the fiberglass tub has a hole, or the metal sink is rusted out. Is it an industry standard to describe the location of the main water shutoff valve? Yes, most SOPs require this, but there is no specific requirement for that in Virginia. But describing the location of the main water shutoff valves, and it is an industry standard, and it's probably a standard of care. It's probably a best practice to do it. I do it. I think you should do it. I've never understood why inspectors make assumptions when there's no SOP or requirement for example. Why guess if there's a public or private sewer or water or sewer? I mean, I know a lot of guys do it. I'm not saying that I just don't understand why you do it. I've never done it. And it's such a liability. There was actually a court case. I wasn't involved in it, but I did set in on it, where a realtor and inspector was sued, and it was over because the client or the buyer thought he had public sewer, and turned out to be a septic tank. So he filed suit. Oh, 3 minutes. Okay. So, and I don't understand it myself, but I understand a lot of people do it. You should at least document the source of it, the MLS, where you got that information, the homeowner, realtor. You should say where you got that information, because you usually can't tell for sure. As public, quiz. What is that? Okay. Is there a defect? It's improperly bonded. Virginia, Maryland have language in their regulations that both require that you describe CSST. Virginia regulations is there, Maryland's there. Don't confuse the gas connector for CSST. There's no requirement to bond or report on a gas connector. Just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I had an inspector that's been around a long time asked me, let me make sure I get this right. He asked me, how long or how short is the CSST before it's considered a gas connector? I said, well, there's two different things there. I said, there's CSST and then there's a gas connector. They're two different products, but you don't want to confuse them. They're different. The gas connectors don't require bonding. CSST does. Before adding a comment to your report, always ask yourself, is it adding any value? If it's no value, you probably should just leave it off. Again, anyone reading your report should know by reading what was inspected. There should be no wondering. Example, if wondering, if I wonder if he or she inspected the toilet in the basement because it doesn't flush. And if the report is silent on that, there could be a problem because, you know, they need to be able to understand that you inspected it. So I'm gonna show you this railing. So it's pretty loose. Is that a safe guardrail? No. The code says that guardrails have to be, have a 200 foot-pound rating. The infill pickets only have to have 50. So here's a snip out of a report. Says handrails are loose, have them required to, so they can withstand a 50 foot-pounds of lateral pressure. And again, he's saying handrails. And then he's talking about the, well, that's not important. But is that correct? That's not correct. Here's another one out of the same report. Well, actually, that's, so here, oh, I'm sorry. It says the building code says that it doesn't say 36 inches high, at least 36 size. It doesn't say 50 pounds on the handrails. This is incorrect information. It discredits the inspector and as well as the whole report. The code talks about handrails have to be 200 pounds. See right over here, right there, 200 pounds on handrail, and guardrails are 200 pounds right there, but the infills is 50. And the height of the handrail is 34 to 38. It's not 36. So when you put something that's factual like that in your report and it's not correct, it basically discredits you. So make sure you have your facts straight. Here's another one out of the same report talking about that the doesn't have guardrails and it's 24 inches off the ground. Is that correct? Yes, 30. The building code says 30, and he talks about type 1 grip. Type 1 grip is just one type of grip. It can be type 2 or equivalent. So he's not correct on that either. Best practice would be, say, recommend handrail. Don't try to go into these specifics. Type 1, it's just a mistake. You're going down a bad road there. Incorrect information discredits the inspector and makes the whole report questionable. That's the type of handrails you can have per the code, type 1, type 2. Are we out of time? All right. So anyway, I wish I could do more, guys, but basically, you know, if you're in Virginia, you got to know that Virginia regulations are a lot more strict than anything else you'll see. So make sure you're complying with the regulations. Same thing goes with the contracts. Contracts are really, really strict in Virginia. Nothing like that in any other state. So that's it.